They came to play, thinking it was all just strategy and smiles, manipulation masked as charm, power games masked as chemistry. They smiled as they dropped loaded compliments, left trails of uncertainty, and fed you breadcrumbs dressed as connection. They weren't clever. They were habitual, predictable, addicted to the same script they've rehearsed on dozens before you. But they didn't account for what happens when the so-called pawn understands the board. They didn't see it coming. The moment when their harmless little games spiraled into something far more lethal. Because you don't just play back, you escalate. And now they've found themselves in a war they cannot control. Because you are the battlefield. You didn't want war. You never needed it. You came with truth. You came with patience. You came with understanding. They saw that as weakness, misinterpreted grace for gullibility. And that's the fatal error people like them always make. They mistake emotional intelligence for emotional dependency. They didn't know you were documenting patterns in your silence, measuring deception by its rhythm, taking note of how often the truth shape-shifted in their mouth. You don't confront in the moment because you understand human behavior. You allow people to reveal themselves entirely before you strike. That's not revenge. That's design. They laughed when you first went quiet, thought they had won, that you had backed down, checked out, vanished into another emotional collapse. But silence was never surrender. Silence was recon. They stopped hearing from you, but you were still watching, still tracing the outline of every move, every contradiction, until one day you moved. Not with emotion, not with a scream, but with an energy so cold, so calculated, it rewrote the temperature in the room. You didn't explode, you removed. And that removal, that was the war cry they never anticipated. You became everything they feared. A player who doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, doesn't come back. Let's break this down psychologically. Players don't expect escalation, they expect confusion. They rely on their target being too emotionally entangled to fight back effectively. They thrive in the gray zone, the halfway space between affection and punishment, but war removes ambiguity. It forces accountability. And when someone like you enters that space, with clarity, with boundaries, with unapologetic execution, they fold. Because games can only continue when the opponent still seeks approval. You don't. You seek dominance through distance. You make every second of silence echo louder than their loudest manipulation. They wanted fun. You gave them ruin. Not with insults, not with exposure, but with detachment so complete it suffocated their ego. You see, war isn't always blood and ash. Sometimes it's a shift, a silence that slices deeper than retaliation, a disappearance that leaves them choking on their own narratives. You didn't destroy them. You simply stopped believing in their illusion. And in doing so, you dismantled the only weapon they had. When you stopped playing, you rewrote the rules. And when someone only exists in games, reality feels like violence. They reached for you after the silence. Not out of love, out of confusion, out of fear. Because nothing is more terrifying to a manipulator than the moment they lose control over your mind. Your calm became confrontation. Your peace became punishment. Every time you didn't respond, they felt the story slipping away, the narrative breaking. You weren't the emotional wreck they hoped to create. You became a mirror of their own chaos. And mirrors, once cracked, don't just reflect. You shatter illusions. That's the real war. Not what you said, but what you showed them they are. You turned the whole stage against them by refusing to participate. You didn't smear, you didn't slander, you just vanished with truth in your spine. And now they sit, haunted by the ending they authored. They blame you, of course, but it's hollow, because deep down they know you didn't destroy them, they set the trap. You just walked away before it could close. And that ruined them, because manipulators depend on closure, not a reaction, on the ability to twist the ending in their favor. You left none. You ended the sentence with a silence so sharp it bled into their identity.
And now?
Now you walk with that strange new power, that quiet composure, that air that makes even strangers feel they should be careful what games they play around you. You don't threaten, you don't project, you just exist with presence, the kind that remembers pain, not with bitterness but with weaponized clarity. You don't seek war, but now you embody it. A walking lesson, a reminder that some people start games with the wrong soul, because not everyone was born to be manipulated. Some were born to be the last move you never saw coming. The game ended, but they still play, with others, with themselves, hoping for a replay, for a redo, but it won't come. Because what you gave them was a once-in-a-lifetime lesson, that sometimes the person they underestimated becomes the architect of their unraveling. You didn't retaliate. You didn't compete. You just transformed, and transformation is something no manipulator prepares for, because it can't be controlled, can't be predicted, can't be undone. You aren't the same. You're sharpened, and every step forward you take without them is a war they never win. They play games because games are safe, calculated, controlled. Games let them mold perception, adjust appearances, and keep emotional consequences at bay. They manipulate emotions not because they seek truth, but because they fear it. They curate reactions, bait drama, twist intentions, all to avoid accountability. It gives them power without pressure, but when you stop playing for their approval, when you evolve beyond the need to be understood by people who weaponize misunderstanding, you become a disruption. Not a participant, not a player, a detonator. And that shift, it sends them into chaos. Because you no longer respond by the rules, you evolve by instinct. You act with precision, and that makes you dangerous in ways they never predicted. They measure their success by the reactions they provoke, by how long you linger in the confusion they manufactured. They confuse control with connection, validation with value. So when you go silent, not as a manipulation, but as a result of clarity, they flinch. Because peace to someone who thrives on power games feels like loss. And that's what you gave them. Not confrontation, not revenge, just the absence of dependence. You no longer orbit their approval. You rise through your own axis. And that shift from proving to becoming removes their last grip. The power they held was always proximity. Once you moved on internally, the war was already won. The stakes change when you stop reacting and start evolving. They wanted you to stay small, desperate for clarity, hungry for recognition, but you stopped seeking their version of truth. You began building your own. Not in spite, in silence, not for performance, for purpose. You realized evolution doesn't need witnesses, growth doesn't need applause, and once you embraced that, their tactics lost teeth. The gaslighting didn't work. The withdrawal didn't sting, because you weren't looking for comfort. You were hunting for freedom, and you found it, not in answers, but in detachment. Now, they watch you differently. You're no longer the version of yourself they felt superior to. You've shed layers they were counting on. The need for validation, the fear of abandonment, the hunger to be seen, it's all gone, burned to ash in the furnace of transformation. What remains is a person who no longer plays, who creates new games altogether. And in this new arena, there are no tokens, no scripts, no lies dressed as loyalty. There's only evolution, the kind that demands sacrifice, the kind that turns pain into presence and silence into strategy. They hate that you no longer explain, that you no longer react, that their name doesn't echo in your actions anymore. Because approval is currency to them, and you've gone off grid. You've stopped attending the auction. Your worth isn't up for sale. They can't barter with confusion, can't provoke with silence. And now they see it. The space between who you were and who you are becoming is too vast for their games to read. Now it's evolution, not just in mind, but in energy. And energy never lies. Let's get clinical for a moment. People who manipulate are addicted to outcome control. They don't want connection, they want compliance. Your growth is a system failure for them. It exposes their patterns, it reveals their lack of depth, and worst of all, it removes their utility. They no longer get to be the center of the maze. Because you burned the maze down, you don't wander anymore. You build paths, and every step forward becomes a mirror of what they'll never become. When you evolved past them, you didn't just leave. You disappeared from their reality entirely. They still talk about you, but not to understand, to regain a sense of power. But that power is now a phantom. Every attempt to re-engage you falls flat. Every memory of control is just that, a memory. And while they spiral, you remain unmoved. You've become the lesson their manipulation never accounted for. Not a warning, a blueprint of what they can't fake. Authenticity, autonomy, ascension. They started with games, you answered with growth. That's the plot twist no manipulator survives. Because games end, but evolution? It erases the need to play at all. You didn't beat them by playing better, you transcended by becoming untouchable. And that's a power no mask can imitate. No lie can replicate. No tactic can touch. You used to flinch, not just externally, but internally, where it counts. Your body reacted before your mind caught up. You felt the heat in your chest, the tremble in your hands, the tight coil of dread around your ribs when a manipulator leaned in with a calm smile and a loaded sentence. And back then, that meant they won. Because chaos doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's engineered so subtly that the world never notices. But your nervous system always does. Your body keeps the score, even when your mind is playing catch-up. And once you stopped ignoring it, once you made a vow to honor your own signals before anyone else's opinions, you stopped being controlled. They never taught you that regulation is rebellion, that staying still, truly still, in the presence of chaos is the most threatening act of power a person can demonstrate. Because stillness is not submission, stillness is containment. It says, I know what you're trying to do and you no longer get to move me. That's what makes manipulators panic. They feed on reaction, that's their currency. Your emotional volatility is what fuels their control. But when your face is unreadable, your body calm, your heartbeat stable in the eye of their storm, you break the loop. You become untouchable, not because you don't feel, but because you've become the gatekeeper of your own system. And that mastery, that unnerves them more than rage ever could. Rage is still engagement. Silence is still war if it comes from fracture. But stillness, real, regulated stillness, is sovereignty. It is when your nervous system has been through enough storms that it no longer bends to projection, no longer coils at criticism, no longer jumps to fix what's broken in others. It stays still because you're done betraying yourself. And when they realize that their chaos has no effect on your biology anymore, that their presence doesn't speed your heart or twist your gut, they know the power has changed hands. They test it, of course. Try to poke, try to stir, try to find the old trigger points. But you've upgraded the entire system. You've reprogrammed what your body listens to. You don't react out of habit anymore. You respond, if at all, from intention, and that shift is nuclear. You can sit across from a person who once made you unravel and look them in the eye with no adrenaline, no panic, no need to explain. That's the moment they realize you're no longer a participant in their theater. You're the observer now, the one holding the remote, not trapped on the screen. Most people think winning looks like control over others, but real power is when you no longer need control at all, only presence. You can walk into the same chaos and leave it untouched because the turbulence no longer has an entry point. The locks have changed. The passwords are different. You don't even speak the same language anymore. Your body doesn't respond to guilt, to threats, to bait. You watch, you calculate, you stay still. And that stillness becomes the most violent thing you ever delivered. Because it says, without saying a word, you lost access. Let's be clear. They will notice. They will feel the absence of tension in you, like a void, like a vacuum, sucking their illusions inward. People don't fear calm people because they are passive. They fear calm people because calm people choose when and how to strike. Your stillness becomes a storm they can't predict. It creates confusion. They start to question their influence, their relevance, their identity in relation to you. Because before, your body flinched when they arrived. Now, they flinch internally when you enter the room. And the beauty is, you didn't force it. You earned it through internal warfare and exquisite self-commitment. Regulating your nervous system isn't about peace, it's about preparedness. You don't want a life free from chaos. That's a fantasy for the fragile. What you want, what you've built, is the ability to walk through fire without smelling of smoke. To remain so in tune with yourself that chaos becomes background noise. You don't avoid the battlefield. You stride through it with the unbothered precision of someone who knows where every sniper is hiding, and they don't understand how. Because they're still playing for attention. You're playing for ascension. They used to own your reactions. Push a button and you'd light up, pull a string and you'd perform. But those days are dead. You took back the wiring, you reprogrammed the panel. Now they can try the same games and all they'll find is silence so profound it feels like punishment. That's what evolution does. It doesn't scream. It outgrows. And every time you remain unshaken in the middle of madness, the ground beneath their manipulation begins to crack. Because now, they're the ones reacting to your silence, to your stillness, to your refusal to play. They've trained the world to obsess over external control. Who holds the mic? Who commands the room? Who wins the argument? They don't teach you that all of that, every ounce of surface dominance, is meaningless if the person behind it is a puppet of their own chaos. They teach posture. Not posture of the spine, but of the ego. Empty display, no core. Because they fear what they cannot model, and that is self-mastery. The war they wanted you to fight was out there, in battles for recognition, validation, reputation. But the war that mattered was happening within you. It always was. And once you learned to redirect your gaze inward, to treat your emotions, triggers, and patterns like terrain to be mapped, you became untouchable. Not because you gained control over others, because you became the commander of your own battlefield. They had no idea you were training, that every heartbreak was a boot camp, that every betrayal was a terrain marker, that every moment of silence wasn't weakness, it was you learning the landscape of your own mind, while they celebrated their small victories, getting under your skin, baiting a reaction, hijacking your peace. You were charting the map. Where you lose control, where you fold, where you freeze, where you pretend. You turned your nervous system into a war journal. You became fluent in the dialect of your own shadows. That's mastery, because most people navigate life like mercenaries, reacting to every hit. You became the cartographer of pain. Mastering your inner terrain isn't poetic, it's violent. You tear up every illusion. You rip out beliefs that once felt like safety. You interrogate every habit, not like a philosopher, but like a military tactician. Why did I freeze when they spoke to me that way? Why did I laugh when I was uncomfortable? Why did I chase instead of retreat? That isn't introspection, it's surveillance. You become the hunter and the hunted, and once you track the trails of your own triggers, you build weapons out of what once broke you. The same terrain they used to dominate you becomes the home court advantage you weaponize with precision. You stopped letting people trespass, not because you became colder, but because you finally understood the cost of letting unworthy hands redraw your maps. That's the price of inner peace. Boundaries drawn in blood. You don't need to argue anymore. You simply don't respond. You don't explain the terrain, you command it. They don't get to come in and plant flags. This is no longer public land. This is sovereign soil. And your silence, it's the border wall. Not built to isolate, but to warn. You may approach, but this terrain is known, and you will be held accountable for your steps. What terrifies them most is that you no longer speak their language. The language of blame, of spiraling, of emotional disarray. You walk into chaos like a general walks into a war room, measured, unmoved. You're not cold, you're calibrated. And that calm, that's not personality, that's architecture. You rebuilt the landscape. When people speak now, you're not just hearing their words. You're tracking where they stand within your terrain. Are they entering with respect, with intent, with confusion, with manipulation? You don't react, you analyze. And if their footsteps are off, you dismiss them before they even know they've lost access. They don't understand it because they never trained for it. They read books, you read yourself. They asked for advice, you asked for accountability. That's the difference between surface intelligence and inner mastery. One reads patterns, the other rewrites them. You don't just see red flags now, you plot them into coordinates. You know the difference between fear and instinct, between discomfort and a warning, and because of that, you move like a ghost through the games that once trapped you. They set traps for your old self, but that version died on terrain you now own. Life is not about removing all conflict. It's about preparing your internal terrain so no conflict can own you. Most people pray for peace. You trained for it. And trained peace becomes enforced peace. You walk into a room and shift the dynamics without speaking, because people sense it. Their subconscious detects the lack of chaos in you, and it unnerves them. You don't react because your body isn't theirs to provoke anymore. You don't apologize for your silence, your clarity, your distance. You earned every inch of that inner land with blood, with solitude, with surgical self-awareness. You didn't just survive the war, you built a kingdom out of the battlefield. They might still talk, they might still test, let them. Their games were designed for someone who hadn't yet mapped the terrain. But now you know where every weak spot once lived. Now you guard every former wound with elite precision. Not paranoia, preparedness. You're not guarded, you're trained. You don't fear heartbreak, you track the emotional climate before it arrives. You don't panic in conflict, you pivot into strategy because your terrain doesn't shift with others' chaos anymore. It holds, it absorbs, it recalculates, and then it proceeds. I am ruthlessly. You used to move constantly, over-explaining, overreacting, overcompensating. Every message, every silence, every look, strategized to keep their comfort intact while you slowly bled under your own skin. You were noisy, with energy, tangled in emotional motion, trying to prevent implosion by buying more time in a rigged game. That chaos wasn't your nature, it was your training. Conditioned to believe movement equals progress, expression equals safety, surrender equals love. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was betrayal, maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the day your nervous system said, "No more." And that silence that followed, that stillness, that wasn't weakness, it was a decision, a pivot, a shift from emotional reactivity to psychological warfare. They don't fear the one who moves constantly, they fear the one who moves with calculation, and that's who you became. You stopped giving them data, you starved them of reactions. You didn't explain, you observed, you didn't justify, you measured. Your presence became surgical, minimal, razor sharp. Because power doesn't announce itself, it lets others feel the weight of its stillness. Every time they tried to provoke and got silence, they felt something new. Because when someone who used to explain everything suddenly says nothing, every word they don't say echoes louder than the last scream. Fewer moves doesn't mean apathy. It means your awareness has become a sniper, waiting, watching, precise. You no longer fire wildly into the chaos, hoping to hit something. You wait until the moment is right, and then you strike once. Clean, cold, and irreversible. That's what makes it terrifying. Not the noise, not the fire, but the fact that you moved once, and the entire room shifted. That's how fear is born. Not from violence, but from velocity combined with silence. You became a force they could no longer measure. And what can be measured can't be managed. Let's talk psychology. The human brain is addicted to predictability. It craves feedback. That's what manipulators feed on. They want movement. They want reaction. They want emotional leakage because it tells them where you're vulnerable. But when you stop giving them anything, when your face is unreadable, your words minimal, your timing deliberate, they panic. They start projecting. They invent motives. They spiral. Because they don't know what you're thinking. And in the absence of information, people fear the worst. That's the weapon of minimal motion. It activates their own mind against them. You've become the glitch in their system. Their old patterns don't work on you. The bait gets ignored, the guilt trips go unanswered, the tests come back inconclusive. And because they've never had to deal with someone who moves only when it matters, they keep playing the same game. Louder, messier, more desperate. But you're not in the game anymore. You are the consequence that arrives once the game is over. You walk differently now. You think in moves, not moments. You observe in layers, not reactions. And that evolution? That's why every small move you make now hits like a bullet through glass.